Okay. If people can, is that all right? Can you see the screen?
Great, yes, thank you.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for inviting me to present, and thanks very much for everyone who's come. So I'm thoroughly looking forward to this. The title is Social Activity is Key to Connecting Mind and World, a realist introduction to the philosophy of E.V. Ilyenkov. So obviously Ilyenkov's philosophy has been introduced to Western audiences in a variety of ways. David Backhurst has been responsible for quite a few of those. One thing I pick out here particularly is looking at developments in Anglo-American philosophy influenced by John McDowell, one of his seminal books, Mind and World, for example. What I do in the paper, which this presentation relates to, is take a new angle, I think, on how to introduce Ilyenkov to a Western audience, and that's to look at something called causal powers realism, of which there has been an explosion very, very recently in Anglo-American philosophy. So the past 15 years or so, we've seen causal powers realism really explode. It also looks at contemporary cognitive science, this 4E development, which both of these things I'll talk about through the course of this presentation. In terms of the text, then the key text is that I refer to is Ilyenkov's book Dialectical Logic, particularly chapters 1 and 2, where Spinoza argues that, Ilyenkov argues that in Spinoza we find a basis to understand Marx and Engels as inverting Hegelian dialectic. Several other of Ilyenkov's texts make a similar argument, often in more condensed form than the book. One example of that is the 1962 translation, which was circulated alongside this particular presentation, to which I'll refer. A reason for that, and thanks very much for Sasha for providing that text, is that I was asked to comment on that particular translation for the forthcoming book, which Sasha is co-editing. And so I'd be very interested to hear from the audience today their thoughts on that text and my particular angle in relation to it. Okay, so how to actually present a topic like this in half an hour is something I fretted over and discussed with Corinna and others. What I'll do is focus on one aspect of Ilyenkov's argument, and that is around the issue of Humean skepticism. Many can take, but in half an hour you've got to do something, so I'll focus in on that. So I would argue that you can see in Ilyenkov a very profound approach to mind and world, and you can see a core element of that in how one would view Ilyenkov's approach to the issue of Humean skepticism. What you find if you look carefully is what I would call a causal powers realist analysis of perception, which gives rise to the skepticism problem. So I quote from Ilyenkov here: "We have within us in the form of ideas not the thing itself and its proper form, but only the inner state, that the effect of the external things evoked in our body." So it's a causal powers realist analysis of perception, very simple one. But what he means is that our minds can only access the causal effects of objects on our sense organs. What we can't do is access the objects themselves. So for causal powers realism, causal powers are possessed by objects in virtue of the real structural essences, their nature or their constitution. And the problem that this causal powers realist analysis of sense perception gives rise to is the human being simply can't access the real structural constitution, and so can't access the real causal powers themselves. All we ever access is their effects upon us, never direct access to the causal powers themselves. So we can't know what they're about to do. We only ever know what they've done, but we can't access them themselves. For all we know, they're about to change and do something completely different. So this is a ground for Humean skepticism. So on this interpretation of Hume, you'd see Hume as taking a Lockean starting point, a causal powers realist argument. In Locke, he talks about real essences, and Locke talks about the fact you can't access real essences because of this problem of sense perception. And Hume just takes that further and says, well, in that case, you can't rationally assume the uniformity of nature. What's interesting about this argument, it doesn't just afflict causal powers realism, I would argue, which is a problem, but it afflicts other areas. So if you look at McDowell's direct realism, I think the strongest argument against that is the causal, the problem of the causal analysis of perception. So I think that's really important, because we can see in causal powers realism a problem, but we can then begin to see actually this problem afflicts other areas of Anglo-American philosophy, not least McDowell. Of course, that's very important because of David Bakhurst being strongly influenced by McDowell, and one route David taking is in terms of, let's see what Ilyenkov has to say in relation to McDowell, because if Ilyenkov can say something speaking to McDowell, then he clearly has something important to say to a Western philosophical audience. Well, if McDowell has a problem of skepticism, then you know, that's significant for that approach. Anyway, let's get on to the solution. Okay, taking it step by step. The first step, I think, in terms of how Ilyenkov approaches the problem and solving it, is to make this argument that, in actual fact, when one looks at if you like, the structural constitution of the mind, the structural constitution of the thinking body at any rate, let's start there, then the first thing to note is actually, unlike the fixed structures, the fixed structural constitutions of objects outside of the mind, of external objects, there's something distinctive that the thinking body and its can do. It can self-change its relevant inner bodily structures. In fact, the obvious ones you'd be thinking about as relevant are the neural structures of the brain. So whilst at any moment there is a fixed structural constitution of the thinking thing, and therefore there's a limit to what it can do because the causal powers of things are possessed in virtue of their inner constitutions, what the thinking thing can do can change its inner structure. So over time, through self-modification of inner structure, this enables a thinking thing to adapt its external mode of activity, and it can adapt to accord with the external things around it. So the thinking thing, unlike other types of thing, is not pre-programmed in advance by some fixed structural essence. It doesn't have structurally inscribed within it a fixed essence. It continually changes its inner structure, so it can vary external its activity with its external context. And I mentioned I would be relating Ilyenkov to contemporary cognitive science, and this is very obvious point that what Ilyenkov is doing here with his argument is very much consonant with contemporary cognitive science's critique of a computational theory of mind, which used to be very much at the fore with cognitive science, which revolved around a fixed set of rules which one would understand the mind with. Well, there aren't a fixed set of rules. We have self-changing inner structures. There's nothing fixed about the mind. Okay, so that's step one. Step two, I suppose, is the big one. What did Ilyenkov say here? What Ilyenkov does here is make an argument that you can, the thinking thing can directly access the things themselves. So it's a holy grail. If this argument works, you're really in business if you've got a philosophy. So let's see what he says and how I try and explain that. The basic point Ilyenkov makes is that the thinking thing must be self-aware. Self-aware of the schema of its own external bodily activity. External bodily activity which is in contact and accordance with the external world. Now, there's lots of bits of that one sentence, but in talking about the schema of external bodily activity, that's everyday activity. I'm now sitting talking to you. I could pick up a cup and have a cup of tea. So that's the kind of external activity we're talking about. It's not microstructural activity of neurons. It's the visible activity, macro scale activity of thinking things. And we have schemas of activity, and those schemas precisely what are in accord with external objects. What's interesting is in cognitive science, contemporary cognitive science, you have various notions about mind, which are all going beyond the computational theory. Mind is embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended. And if you think through this sentence, this idea of Ilyenkov's, you've got all of them there in the one sentence. The only thing I'll focus on is this notion of schema. The notion of schema of activity is very important with the new cognitive science approach to mind. And it's interesting that Ilyenkov focuses in on it. What Ilyenkov then says is that ideas, adequate ideas, consist in self-awareness of adequate schemas of activity. That, I think, is distinct to Ilyenkov and a key insight. And such self-awareness directly connects mind and world. And so that's the argument. Let's try and unpack it. Because if that works, as I say, we've got something remarkable on our hands, philosophically speaking. So how I'm going to do that, I'm going to go and compare to those two developments I mentioned earlier, causal powers realism and contemporary cognitive science. I'll start with causal powers realism and try and explain a bit of the argument that Ilyenkov's made in relation to the notion of emergence that you find in causal powers realism. More generally, it's sometimes discussed as the issue of downward causation. I'll then move on to cognitive science. Okay. What this explanation, this notion of ideas as being self-awarenesses of the external activity of the body means is that external, everyday, macro-scale human activity, not just microstructures like neurons, explains ideas. In terms of emergence, you would put it that the emergent power of thinking is not emerging just from a microstructure like a neuron, it's emerging from everyday activity at the macro scale in contact accordance with other objects. So usually in causal powers realism, it's not like that. Usually you'd say, well, microstructures give rise to emergent powers. So my son over there is very loudly having a drink of water, which is interesting. And what that means is he's able to quench his thirst, the power of water to quench his thirst. Here I've got another power of water to boil at 100 degrees. How do we explain that? We explain that as a power of water which is possessed by virtue of a microstructure, the H2O molecule. But that's not happening with this explanation of ideas. Macro scale activities themselves are explaining ideas, not microstructures. Why is that important? Well, Well, because if we just continually think it's some fixed microstructure like a neuron giving rise to ideas, they're absolutely nothing like the objects that ideas are ideas of. But here, ideas are being explained by the thinking thing's external bodily activity, which is very much like the objects that the thinking thing is actually thinking about. The activity of the bodily activity of a thinking thing is in contact and direct accordance with its object. Indeed, as humans develop, they develop their activity to be more and more in accordance with more and more things. There's a direct connection between mind and world through the ability of the thinking body to be self-aware of its activity amongst other bodies. So you've got away from thinking of something, one completely different essence, a neuron, somehow generating ideas which give rise to activity which is in accord with the object, which has a completely different essence. We don't have two completely different essences. We have a body which is acting in accord with an object. Okay. Next big thing in terms of this argument. Actually, well, if you think about it, you'd normally think that ideas give rise to activity. But what I've just said is that activity, mode of activity and contact accordance with external objects, gives rise to ideas. So the next logical question is, well, what gives rise to that accordance in the first place? And that's where you can use a little bit of contemporary cognitive science, the embodied mind approach in cognitive science, to help explain that initial accordance between the activity of the thinking thing and the external object. So if we just look at a key concept in the embodied mind approach, okay, there's many embodied mind approaches in cognitive science. I'm fixing in on one, which is a notion of coupling or structural coupling. This goes as follows. In the course of evolution, living things couple within particular environmental niches. So a giraffe grows a long neck, and that enables it to eat from trees. And so it's both its shape and its bodily activity is in accord with a particular environmental niche, that of trees and the leaves that the giraffe eats. So it's a very simple idea of coupling. So there's an accordance between the activity of the living thing and the external environment. And this is the case for all living things, from amoeba to complex animals. That's very important because it means you're getting an accordance between the living thing and the external world, but you don't need mental representations, ideas, for that accordance to occur, for that coupling to occur. And indeed, in the embodied mind approach to cognition, it is therefore sometimes argued that you don't need mental representations in order to understand cognition. And that argument is put as one of the reasons to jettison the computational theory of mind. So boot out the computational theory of mind, and along with that, boot out any notion of mental representations representing the world to a thinking subject. Well, I like the idea of coupling, but I really don't see that it's possible to coherently boot out mental representations. So what I think Ilyenkov, I would interpret Ilyenkov to be doing here, is to be saying that ideas emerge precisely as representations of external objects, but we can build up a picture of how that occurs, an evolutionary and historical one, which does have a role for this notion of structural coupling. So historically, what one can think is happening is self-awareness emerges initially to give the thinking thing direct access to the its mode of activity in a contact and accordance with a specific niche. So as ideas emerge, thinking things are able to be aware of activity in contact and accordance with the external world. If you're a giraffe, it would be a tree. because that's your niche. But obviously, when you can begin to be self-aware of activity, then you can begin to change, modify that activity. And so self-awareness enables a thinking thing to reflect and expand its mode of activity to embrace more and more niches. So in an evolutionary perspective, instead of specializing on one niche or other, the thinking thing, humans in our case, expand our activity, and they cease to be niches. You're not in one niche or another, you're expanding our activity without limit, and that's what thought does. So you end up with a socio-historical self-development that is characteristic of thinking things, which involves ideas. Structural coupling is part of this story, but it's not the end of the story. The story goes on to involve ideas of representations of the external world. Okay, so those are core big arguments, which I tried to sort of understand Ilyenkov's key argument in terms of these contemporary literatures. I would stress that I'm sure there are people who are experts on various elements of these literatures, have far more expertise than I, so very, very interested to hear more from you after I've finished. Okay, step 3 though. Social cultural representation of real essences of objects. So here you develop more an understanding of social activity and how in this ongoing development of social activity expanding, thinking things are able to become self-aware of these objects. And in order to do so, ideal forms emerge. So what an ideal form is an objective social cultural representation of the object. How does that emerge? What does that mean? So in order to gain self-awareness, there emerges, it could be a word, it could be a symbol. Where this comes from, where Ilyenkov derives this from, is actually from Marxian value form analysis. So he's thinking of money as representing the value of commodities. There emerges a thing which takes on a function to represent another thing. It's not just representing any old bit of the other thing. The crucial thing that happens is that this thing, the sign, can represent the essence of the object. You can give an account, a historically emergent account of how ideal forms socially emerge in the development of society, which enable individuals or facilitate individuals to understand the essence of the objects around them. So that's social cultural representation of real essences in Ilyenkov. That's very important because it's not just, it gives you this objective culture, it gives you a whole realm of ideal forms, which involve signs, symbols, words, plans, designs, models of place, etc., which mingle and mix in with objects of which the ideal forms are enabling you to have a concept of their essence. So it's a very interesting development, but it involves representation. You're representing the real essence of an object in ideal form, but this is representation understood very differently from a computational theory of mind. So we don't have to boot out, or at least you can say the following. If you want to boot out the idea of representation, or discard that and say mental representations aren't possible, well, you can't do that to Ilyenkov's notion of representation on the ground that computational theory of mind is inadequate. Ilyenkov does not have a computational theory of mind, but he does have a theory of representation, ideas representing objects. So don't confuse the two. Okay. Obviously, there's a heck of a lot more to it, and I could have explained the little bit I did explain better, no doubt. The main, where does Ilyenkov go from here? broadly, I would argue he develops from the abstract basis, which is basically Spinozist basis. A key area of development is to recognize that it's not just the case that human beings continually adapt to external objects. So how do you get their activity in accordance with the external thing? Well, they adapt. They have to adapt to accord with external causal powers. They do more than that. They transform the world. You can take these external objects and you can rearrange them to get new emergent powers. You can't abolish their causal powers. You can't abolish the laws of nature, which the causal powers gives rise to. But you can work with causal powers to achieve your end as a purposeful thinking thing. So yes, you move from what is a Spinozist concept of substance to a Marx and Engels concept of social labour, where in social labour we transform objects. But that, and in social labour you do express purpose, but that is done on the basis of the laws of nature fixed in real causal powers, which you have to respect. You can't change the laws of nature and these real causal powers. So before you talk about transforming social labour, restoring nature through social labour, you have to recognise that there are real causal powers out there which social labour has to respect and act in accord with. So you start off with an argument about bodily activity being in accordance with social, the object, before you can talk about social labour transforming the object. So I know David Backhurst is listening. So David, in my paper, I make this, I feel that that's a really important point, that there's this moment in the argument, it's a very abstract moment, a Spinozist moment, where we're talking about human beings according with external causal powers. And, you know, if you're going to, that gives some legit, well, I feel that's a key point in the argument that social activity overcomes key problems of knowledge like Humean skepticism. If we don't recognise external causal powers imposing themselves such that human activity has to act in accordance with them, then there isn't any significance to social activity. It just expresses mind, and then you wonder where the hell minds come from. But if you do recognise that social activity is bounded by, has to accord with real causal powers, then all of a sudden social activity is much more epistemologically interesting, and there's more mileage in the possibility that Ilyenkov may have something profound to say at a philosophical level about skepticism. I will listen at the end. I've come to the end. I do want to say, and what's really important about this, you know, I'm an economist or a political economist, Marxian political economist. You know, I have to try and analyse the real economy, the terrible recession we're in, and to do that, I need to understand a very complex object like capitalist political economy, and this grounding, this argument I've gives you the most abstract grounding for the method of ascent from abstract to concrete, which is essential in the job I do. And, you know, that's another whole other aspect of Ilyenkov, which is so important. But as I say, all that more concrete stuff's great, but it all retains the abstract Spinozist solution to the problem of mind and world that I've tried to outline in this talk. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. That was great. Sasha, if you need to go, do you want to say your question, or shall I read it out?
Hi. Yeah. Thanks, Kira. Okay, I have to go soon, so that's why I posed my question first in the chat. Yeah. First of all, thank you, Andy. It's a brilliant presentation. I think Ralph may have a question on the relation to Humean skepticism. Mine is not so much on the relation to Hume, but in relation to the debates you were referring to, I think you brilliantly included the causal realism issue and the embodied mind issue, distinguish them from Ilyenkov. It's really good. The question would be then how we express Ilyenkov's position towards these debates. I mean, is a solution really fitting the debates at all? Or is it just another kind of approach which makes their questions seem inadequate in the first place? So the question would just be how can we deal with this different kind of solution he comes up with in regard with contemporary debates?
So, which contemporary? Do you have particular contemporary debates in mind?
Well, I'm just was referring to those you mentioned.
Okay.
I think you spoke most. I think your main argument was that he can have something to say, not so much maybe on skepticism, but on the realism issue.
Okay, thank you. I understand. Well, this is the fascinating thing. The causal powers realist literature in Anglo-American philosophy has only been going 15 years. And guess what? There is now about 6, 7, 8 articles by key members of the causal power realist community, which have recognized the problem of collapse to Humean skepticism. So the key originator of this new causal powers realism is Brian Ellis, 2001 book, 2002 book, and in 2004, if not earlier, Helen Beebe, who is a very well-respected mainstream philosopher, said, "Fantastic book, Brian, wonderful, but don't you just collapse to Humean skepticism after all? Why can't electrons just suddenly do something different tomorrow?" And the fact is that Ellis has never, he doesn't even try and answer the question. So that's led to, now there's a whole list of articles by key people. So that's why it's been so fascinating for me. It is a key problem recognized in that literature.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm not sure. Do you have a question, Ralph, that you could form out of that in terms of skepticism and relating it to, or do you feel that Andy's already addressed that?
Actually, a more important question. If I may, I have a more important question because, the question is the objectivity of scientific theories and scientific generalizations. Some other problem. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Sometimes there's the question of direct perception in the material world is one thing, and the construction of scientific theories based on experiments and apparatus and so forth is something that goes beyond that, right? Which is one reason I have a problem with the Hume thing. But the thing that confuses me is the idea that our macro-scale interaction with the environment, rather than, let's say, micro-scale interaction, like understanding the chemical constitution of substances, why that would be the basis of our conception of objectivity. That's a very confused, it has that been presented clearly. And I don't really understand how that fits together, especially with respect to verifying the authenticity of of our abstract ideas about the composition of matter and physical law and so forth. I'm very confused about the macro-scale, micro-scale thing.
Okay. So we typically think in terms of theory ladeness of observation. So that's a big problem. Now, one can articulate the theory ladeness observation in many different ways. The one way of thinking about this argument is that the most abstract way of understanding the theory ladeness of observation is through recognizing that the real essences of objects out there are perceived through the sense organs in such a way that they stimulate our brain in a certain way. And so what we have direct access to is that stimulation to our brain. So if you want, we never get access to the real thing out there. We get access to this stimulation, the effect of that thing on our brain. But that means that there is the stamp of our brain structure on all thoughts. So if you like, it's laden with, the theory that we're laden with, this is a very abstract argument, is our brain structure. And we simply can't get away from our brain structure. There's nothing you can do about it. So that way of thinking, I mean, the notion of the theory-ladenness observation is just prevalent everywhere in contemporary Western discourse. And I think where this microstructure, macrostructure thing is coming is it's trying to say, look, at the end of the day, these microstructures of the brain are facilitating thinking, but they're not identical with thinking. And you know what? There's something else which facilitates thinking, which isn't a small microstructure of the brain. It's our macro level activity that we see around us. And the difference between that microstructure of the brain and our macro level activity is, if you think about it, our macro level activity is precisely in accordance with the object. There's no way you can see a load of neurons firing as being anything utterly different to a table or indeed the microstructure of the table. But you can very much see our activity, external activity, being in accord with tables. We made the tables. So you're looking for a material structural accordance. So you're not saying that one thing somehow knows one completely different thing. So that's where this argument about macrostructures is coming from. I found it very difficult to make the argument because what way we think, it's very hard to get to make the argument. I know I won't have succeeded yet, but that's where it's going. I'm trying to make it a bit clearer how ideas are not in fact utterly different to objects in the manner described. Sorry, I can't do any better than that. Thanks.
Thanks. So I think it's Sasha Shomaba, then David, then Ian, if you want to ask your question in the chat box after that. So Sasha.
Thank you. As a student of Ilyenkov, who was lucky enough to know him and learn from him, I'm especially pleased to see how much interest his scientific works arouses in the world today. And it's all the more pleasant to take part in the discussion of the report of a colleague who took up the most difficult, but at the same time the most important in the theoretical legacy of Ilyenkov, problem of the identity of thinking and being. It's very difficult to discuss such a serious topic because the responsibility is very high and because the topic itself is so great that a meaningful conversation on such a topic can hardly be included in the framework of our forced short meeting. So I'm going to limit myself to a few comments and ask a few questions. First and foremost, I fully agree Andrew's opinion that the first two essays of dialectical logic are the pinnacle of Ilyenkov's work. And the second thing is that from the Spinozistic definition of thinking as a way of action of the thinking body, should take a step forward understanding step forward to more perfect understanding. The first step, and a step of great historical significance, made in this direction by Ilyenkov himself. But it's clear that he has left many unresolved problems and unresolved contradictions to our part. And I think the main problem is the problem of interpretation of so-called Marxist reservation at the end of the second essay, in which he talks about the need to enrich Spinoza's original idea with the concept of culture. It's not difficult to see that Ilyenkov pondered his problem for the rest of his life. And the relevance of this problem lies in the fact that until its dialectical solution is found, Ilyenkov philosophy will be vulnerable to reproach that successfully removing psychophysical dualism by aid of Spinoza, he, in addition to his desire, fall into the trap of dualism of nature and culture. And in the end, two questions. First, perhaps a little naive. Why do you use the term thinking thing rather than thinking body? Ilyenkov thinks not, in Ilyenkov's theory, thinks not an abstract object, but a living body. So I think that more relevant will be the term living body, thinking body. Second, how do you understand self-awareness? As the action in the shape of an object or as an abstract mental function? You of course understand that in the latter case, we lose all the advantage of Spinozian materialism and only move idealistically understood consciousness somewhere deeper into the person. And in conclusion, you really understand the amoeba not as a thinking body, that is a body capable of action by the form of its object, but as Cartesian machine. And how can take place such a miracle then in the evolution a human being or high animals at least receive their possibility to think, to act, not mechanically. Thank you, that's all.
Thanks.
Can I answer?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions, Sasha. Thinking thing. What I'd like to try to do is explain Ilyenkov using the term thinking thing. I personally am happy with the term thinking body, but I don't see why you can't use the term thinking thing, and I'm aware of the debates around this matter. I agree, actually thinking body is sharper, but nevertheless, I think you can do it with thinking thing as well. Maybe you disagree with that. Next, in terms of, the whole issue around the last few paragraphs of chapter 2, where Marx talks about going beyond Spinoza to the concept of social labour, and that's where a lot of the debate lies. I think it's that obviously there's difficulty there. The interesting thing about the chapters is they never elaborate. So what you're actually starting to debate when you get onto that issue is not just the understanding of Spinoza in the first 2 chapters, but it's the understanding of all the rest of Ilyenkov's philosophy as laid out in all the other chapters, and as you saw in the transcript. I'd have 2 comments. One comment is, this issue of avoiding a miracle, that's a key question, because the whole point of what Ilyenkov's doing, which comes out more in his critique of Descartes, is avoiding a miracle. With Descartes, there's a miracle that thought somehow causes bodily activity. So I agree with your question. That's the key question. We have to avoid miracles. The second thing is that I suppose, well, no, I'll leave it there. That's my only comments. Otherwise, we won't have time for any more. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think David and then Ian.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks. Thanks, Andrew, very much for that very stimulating paper, which covered such a huge amount of ground that it's not easy to find something to focus on. So I just have a couple of remarks, really. First I want to second Sasha Sumava's remark that this issue of the identity of thinking being is absolutely central to Ilyenkov's philosophy. And there's a good article of Ilyenkov's on this, which is rarely cited. It's a 1964 paper called The Identity of Thinking and Being in Pre-Marxist Philosophy. It's not really exclusively about pre-Marxist philosophy. I think Ilyenkov sort of rather cunningly cast it with that title because he realized he was prone to be attacked for idealism or whatever because of the rather Hegelian way he approaches these issues, and so he casts it as a purely sort of historical piece. But it comes at some of the ground that the early chapters of, in fact, the whole of dialectical logic addresses. It's worth reading, and it's available in translation. It was translated in, I think, Russian Studies in Philosophy. If people want the reference, I can find it. You may all know it anyway, but I just thought I'd mention it. So the first thing, and again, this is really seconding something Sasha said, because it seems to me absolutely critical in the kind of account you gave that we have an account of what our self-awareness of our own activity amounts to. And I think you said that we have a kind of direct self-awareness of activity. And so that would suggest that somehow we know what we're doing. And there's a sense in which it's true in that intentional action presupposes that that there's some description of the action under which the agent knows what they're doing. If that's not true, then you're not acting intentionally. But what kind of account of that are we to give on Ilyenkov's philosophy? And it seems to me that our direct understanding, insofar as our understanding is direct, it nonetheless has to be mediated by concepts, because you understand yourself as pouring a glass of water, or as walking in the park, or as attempting to build a theory of electrons, or whatever, right? And so that immediately brings in precisely something that we were trying to work up to by starting with this sort of basic self-awareness. So I'm not saying that that's an insuperable problem, but it's something that needs to be addressed. And secondly, Humean skepticism, which has provoked a certain amount of skepticism itself in the chat. Well, I think it's interesting that Ilyenkov pays pretty scant attention to Hume. He's not fond of British empiricists in general. I think Ilyenkov's answer to Humean skepticism, I think he thinks that Kant makes the right move against Hume, namely that the concept of the uniformity of nature is part of the categorical structure which makes experience possible. He just thinks that Hegel is right in giving a socio-historical account of the categories. So the fundamental forms of thought, and the notion of a form of thought and category as well, are terms Ilyenkov's very happy with, very familiar with, and wrote a lot about. In fact, there's a new edition of his collected works coming out in Russian at the moment, as some of you will know. And the first volume, I think, is called Categories. And it's a great fat book of his writings on fundamental categories. So I think that's the way Ilyenkov approaches this. And of course, the question of what makes it the case that our categories are in accord with reality is something that Ilyenkov will cast in terms of activity. I think there's no doubt about that. But how that argument has to go is something, I've struggled with that in my own writings, not entirely successfully. Anyway, that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. I think there is a key, simple answer one can start with, which is the following. what you're self-aware of is not, it's not just being self-aware of your activity. You know, a horse is self-aware of its activity as it's tethered to a post, and as it walks around, it will be self-aware of its activity making a circle. What's significant is being self-aware, self-conscious of the mode of activity, the scheme of activity. The horse has no idea of the formula for a circle. The horse is not able to articulate that formula for a circle. And that's really important. And in Ilyenkov's text, it's not clear. And actually, in what I said, it wasn't clear. Because once you have in your head, it's mode of activity that's important, you naturally sometimes say self-aware of activity. But self-awareness of activity is not it, really. It's self-awareness of mode of activity. And of course, the mode of activity is internally related to actually what Spinoza, the whole. It's an internally related whole, an infinite whole. So just because you're self-aware of your mode of activity in context and accordance with a vanishing moment of an infinite whole, it's important. It stops, on my argument, Humean skepticism, but it does not stop the problem of knowledge, because you then have to build up knowledge of a whole on the basis of your scant knowledge of a few objects around you which are internally related to it. And that's the movement from abstract to concrete, which is all about categories. I absolutely agree. The categories are very important. Kant was very important to Ilyenkov for developing a dialectic of categories. Hegel was very important for recognizing that they historically evolved. But what Ilyenkov is saying is that for Kant and for Hegel, in the end, they can't understand this activity as being activity within a real world. The causal powers are out there, and that's why I stressed at the end of my talk this notion that causal powers imposing themselves on us, on our labour. Our labour cannot change the laws of nature. Okay, I'll stop there. In terms of other points that you made, absolutely, Hume. Ilyenkov, though, if you look, does talk a lot about the critique of positivism, neo-positivism, critique of Russell, and Hume, and Locke a little bit. But I think much more profound, as far as Ilyenkov's concerned, is Descartes. Hume is just a pre-runner to Descartes. Descartes gets the dialectical contradiction, the opposition between thought as completely lacking body and body itself. And Descartes' the more profound thinker, and that's why Descartes is who Ilyenkov really focuses on, I think. I better stop there, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Ian and then Corinna.
Yeah, I should begin with an apology because I must leave at about 6:05 because I have to be in class. And then also a second apology because I hope I'm not raking over something which you're all familiar with. This is my first of these sessions, so it's to do with this idea of the abstract and the concrete. I would be just interested to hear a little more about that, because my understanding of it, I think, is slightly at odds with that in the presentation tonight. I sort of have, I take pretty much the line that I think Marx is taking in the Grundrisse or in Capital, where he talks about the abstract almost as being, well, it's not, for him, I think the abstract is not so much the ethereal or the theoretical. It's a way of analyzing the real, taking things, abstracting things out of their real life situation so that they can be considered. And then the ascent to the concrete is when we work with our abstractions to move them back to the real world, if you like. And I wasn't sure that that's what Andrew understood by abstract and concrete. So that's all.
Oh, thank you very much for that question. So, yeah, I mean, the development from abstract to concrete is about Hegelian dialectics, or inverted Hegelian dialectics in Marxian terms. But all Spinoza gives you is an abstract grounding for that, but he does not give the development of that notion of developing from abstract to concrete. You do have the beginnings of it, though. So the whole I just talked about, the whole of nature, which Spinoza refers to as substance or real infinite nature, is a universal, and it has generative. It generates its own partial forms. So you have this concrete universal generating its forms from within itself, which is the beginning of that notion of concrete is the beginning of what you need to begin to justify the detailed development from abstract to concrete that you're talking about. But that's it. The actual idea that you can develop from abstract to concrete and from simple to complex through identifying contradictions in the simple and abstract concepts and building them up from there, I don't think is explicit in Spinoza, and it's a different paper, and I'd go to the Grundrisse like you. It is an excellent starting point to understand that. Thank you.
Thanks, Karina, and then I do have a question as well. And if others have one, do say in the chat that you want to speak. Karina.
Okay, thank you, Carol, and thank you, Andy. I just want to pick up actually on some of the last points. As this is about the role of activity as the connection between mind and body, and activity isn't just physical activity outside the body. Activity is also the activity of the mind and the activity and practice of cognition itself. So what you have, in the coupling, which is actually the self-related opposites of mind and nature, or human beings and nature, these are self-related opposites. And in the movement of cognition, thought, we have actually two processes. One is, both of them have their internal self-movement. So there's the self-movement, Andy rightly, the infinite self-movement that is the object, and the subject, which has its own self-movement. And these two come together in a dialectic. So it's just to expand the concept of activity to include that it's mental activity, it's cognition, and which is what we're really concerned with. So I think that kind of helps to understand that, and the development of concepts is mediated by the concepts, as I think David mentioned, the importance of development of concepts. And really this problem of is there a direct connection? There is and there isn't. There's a direct connection of sensation through sensation from the object to the subject, but to develop the concepts and to develop the development of awareness, you have it has to be mediated, and that's a process. That's a connected but also separate process. So I kind of like the thinking of the coupling as a dialectic, self-related opposites in each of these couplings. So I don't know if that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. It does help, and I mean the nuanced articulation of this dialectic of the ideal is what you're getting into. In many ways, all I'm doing is going to the most abstract basics on which you can found that more detailed exposition, and it in some sense is very, very simple. I mean, you're just trying to get over the Humean problem, and the problem. This notion of causal powers realism is very useful to do that, because causal powers realism is saying there's a real structural essence by virtue of which there are powers. Why is that useful? Because then you can see that if mind is one real structural essence, the structure of the brain, and dots and neurons, and all the other objects are other structural essences with their own causal powers, then never the twain shall meet. You haven't got a bloody clue what's going to happen next, because you can never get beyond your own structural essence. That's not a very dialectical argument. I mean, in the end, Spinoza makes it a dialectical one. The problem gets, like I said to David, the problem I just articulated is a problem of the difference between idea and object, which is a Humean problem. Descartes' much more profound. He gets the opposition, the opposite. He recognizes that thought has no essential spatial determinations whatsoever. And that gives you a much more profound problem, and Spinoza's is a much more profound solution. And then you can get on to more profound things like, you know, developing in the way you said. So all I'm doing is very, very basic. But I would argue that that very, very basic thing, which is saying, actually, no, ideas aren't these different things from objects. Ideas are associated with forms of activity which are in contact and accordance with objects. Don't think of a neuron and some other thing. Think of activity in accordance with the object, and suddenly you're in a different ball game than Hume was. That's all I'm doing. It's not very dialectical, it's not very clever, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be getting through to Western philosophy.
Thanks. And yeah, just a comment from me to bring it back to the sort of a dialogue with Western philosophy to in a way, bring it back also to McDowell as well. I think it's interesting that McDowell, who's drawing ideas from Wilfrid Sellars, we can sort of separate that tradition, as Richard Rorty has, into what McDowell calls the scientific image of man and the manifest image of man, and very crudely, there are right-wing Solarians who focus on the scientific image, which originates in the pragmatism of Charles Sanders Peirce, which seems closer to what you're giving, and McDowell is focused on a kind of a manifest image. But McDowell's liberal naturalism, he sees it as a bulwark against communitarian philosophy. And for example, he reinterprets the master bondsman dialectic as an individual process of self-reflection that each individual sort of goes through. And Stephen Holgate has pushed against that to say, well, that's not the point of Hegel, because if you appreciate that concepts are something which we're actually engaging in activity, then you can't passively really take this realist stance of sort of examining how the world is arising to me. You have to appreciate activity as something that's sort of reconstituting concepts. And I see Ilyenkov as kind of offering quite a good solution to fusing those images in terms of not only offering that scientific image, but to answer Ralph's worries about how does this supervenience or emergence happen. I think through concepts, and Sellars is someone who talks about that, and Ilyenkov, I think, addresses it in an interesting way as well.
Thank you. I don't know enough on McDowell and Holgate. Scientific image, manifest image, Sellars, space of reasons versus space of causes, yes. And obviously David, is very good at bringing out how that problematic space of reason, space of cause is important. Again, what I feel is that Sellars, well, actually, I'm not going to say about Sellars, but the way McDowell uses Sellars, the way McDowell articulates space of reason, space of causes, doesn't seem to me to get at the fundamental problem or its solution. He doesn't engage with causal powers realism when he talks about space of reason, space of cause. Funnily enough, McDowell does engage with causal powers realism with his old moral realism. It's all about, he talks about Locke and Lockean real essence, but they vanish when you're talking about Sellars. And I think that's interesting. But I'll make a point about Hegel, actually, because, again, for all Hegel's greatness, he doesn't seem to me, think of Hegel's critique of Hume, Hegel's critique of this idea, effectively, that there's, the indexical definitions, you can just see something out there. No, Hegel says there's effectively this theory lameness of observation. Good, fine, but that's not either the understanding of Hume or the solution to Hume that I've given following Ilyenkov. I think there's a deeper problem in Hume, which I've outlined, and that Hegel doesn't address, although I say that, he must address it somewhere. But, you know, the thrust of it, as Ilyenkov says, he doesn't address. Sorry, I'll let someone else.
And Katie. You're muted, Katie. Katie, you're muted. We can't hear you. Okay.
My question was about comparison with the cognitivism and about environmental niches. I think that it's important that in cognitive science, thought is located also externally. But I think for Ilyenkov, this notion of environment and of coupling would be quite weird and wrong to apply, because for him, activity is initial to causality. Activity is antecedent to any immediacy of the object, to any immediacy of the thing. And this cultural element is antecedent even to certain perceptive merits of objects. Therefore, I would debate about the possibility of using the word environment and maybe even the notion of causality, because maybe activity contradicts a more psychological notion of causality. Thank you.
I was actually going to say that, well, thank you very much for the question. I'm not going to, I simply don't know enough on the cognitive side. Maturana is, you know, it seems to have a lot to say in embodied mind, and that's where I was looking at structural coupling. But, you know, I'm just not an expert enough so I'll have to go back in light of what you said. In terms of causality and immediacy, look, I do think there's something in Ilyenkov which is about causality and immediacy. I mean, Ilyenkov's saying, look, when you act, you bash up against causal things, and that marks your activity. If that's not the case, activity simply has no epistemic significance. Activity just expresses something called mind, and gets you nowhere. But if actually you are bashing up against objects when you act, then as you continue to act, your actions become molded by those objects. So self-awareness of your actions, your mode of activity in accordance with objects, certainly has massive epistemic significance. And in that sense, I think a simple notion of causation and, you know, hitting up directly with objects is very important. It gets you knowledge of parts. It's ridiculous to say you don't know there's a chair or thing in front of you you're bashing. The issue of error is that you don't know how that part fits in with a whole. And that's the epistemic problem. It's not we can't access objects. It's that we don't immediately know how the objects function within the whole. And that's what the development from abstract to concrete is about. Anyway, I'm sure I haven't answered very effectively, but thank you very much for the question.
Thanks a lot. And I think we're going to take it back to Karina. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. We should finish here, but I'd like to thank Andrew and everyone for taking part. I think it's been really rich discussion, and it's not over yet. I think there's a lot more avenues to explore.